come to think of it, this would make a fascinating study of voter psychology. I submit if we just put Woody's name on the ballot, circulate a few posters of his attractive, smiling face over some meaningless slogan, come election day, we'll get 10% of the vote.
In the months since Joe Biden has become president of the United States, many people have expressed their clear disapproval of the man, going to some extreme lengths to display as much. But Joe Biden received more votes than any other person and president in US history. So the angry Trump-voting sore losers are clearly in the minority. But while so much attention has been paid to the salty Trump supporters, what about those who voted for Biden? How do they feel? While of course many people are going to be happy with their choice to vote for Joe Biden, if for no other reason than because he's not Trump, surely others must be just a little bit embarrassed with his performance in his first few months in office due to his seemingly never-ending gaffes.
If it holds near and dear to you that you like to be able to... Anyway.
Which were on full display at the June G7 Summit, an annual intergovernmental political forum wherein world leaders meet to discuss current events. Up until G7, Biden's public speaking events have been pretty highly controlled, with him having lists of specific questions and answers, and reporters that he wants to call on.
I'll take your questions, and as usual, folks, they gave me a list of the people I'm going to call on. So, Jonathan, Associated Press.
But G7 was free range and made evident to those perhaps not paying so much attention due to the fact that there's simply no more Trump to constantly fill the news cycle, just what kind of state the president appears to be in.
I'll be in better shape to talk to you about it. I'll tell you what they sent me.
For example, Biden interrupted Boris Johnson to insist that he had not yet introduced the South African president when Boris, in fact, already had done so.
Oh, you did? I did not. I certainly did.
He mistakenly referred to the Royal Air Force as the RFA, a simple enough mistake, to be fair. He at one point seemed confused by a simple question from a journalist and needed to be quickly escorted away by his wife, who had previously told him to concentrate at the conference. He confused Libya with Syria, and then a few days later confused the Tuskegee Airmen, the famous group of brave African-American World War II pilots, with the Tuskegee experiment, wherein African Americans were intentionally infected with syphilis to study its effects. That's a pretty big difference, Joe. The G7 conference really put on display the mental caliber of the United States president for the rest of the world, which produced images like this, and many have been mocking or showing concern for his mental state, from anchors at Australia's Sky News to Joe Rogan.
Yeah. I mean, you could say Joe Biden is the president, he's our leader, and you'd be correct on paper, but I mean, everybody knows he's out of his mind.
And most recently, he gave us this performance at a presidential town hall.
And the question is whether or not we should be in a position where you are. Why can't the experts say we know that this virus is in fact is going to be, or excuse me, we know why all the drugs approved are not temporarily approved but permanently approved.
Of course, the last 4 years has pretty much been a constant stream of negative media coverage of Trump's gaffes. But it seems that G7 was the first time that many Americans, and many people internationally as well, got a good look at the seemingly confused Joe Biden. And there's certainly no shortage of compilations of Biden losing his train of thought, saying something bizarre, or generally seeming confused. The microscope that was on Trump for 4 years, who is lambasted comparatively for dumping too much fish food into a koi pond at a previous G7 summit, is seemingly unfocused on Biden. Given there was really so very little coverage of Biden when he was on the campaign trail, and how it seems that he's being shielded from a lot of criticism when he's at public events, at least compared to Trump, who received no such favors from the media, how does winning or losing an election, and the subsequent behaviors of the person that we have voted for, affect our feelings towards that politician as their behaviors and actions are made manifest to the public? Today, let's examine the effects of cognitive dissonance on perceptions of politicians, and if we can come to regret our vote, or if instead, we choose to selectively expose ourselves only to information that makes the person we voted for look good, if only by a lack of access to contradictory data, or because we don't want to regret our vote. So do Biden voters feel uncomfortable when they see him perform these gaffes? Or is it really only non-Biden voters who are even aware of them or feel embarrassed by them? Do fans of Trump or of Biden or of any politician intentionally avoid negative information about their favorite politician, such as to also avoid psychological discomfort? Or do they explain to themselves why that really is the person they wanted to vote for? Let's begin then by looking at dissonance and politics. But real quick before we do, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, Established Titles. Forget the modern world in politics and become a Lord or Lady of Scotland by checking out Established Titles and helping to save the beautiful natural Scottish landscape in the process. But to help me out with the ad, let me employ the assistance of a Scottish Lord himself.
Established Titles is a company that allows you to purchase a plot of land in Wigtownshire, Scotland, making you a Scottish Laird or Lady. And for every plot of land purchased, Established Titles plants a tree in the area. Not only do they help restore the environment, Established Titles helps keep the entire woodland free from any other uses except for the peaceful enjoyment of the land, and thereby protecting it from development. By buying a Laird or Ladyship with Established Titles, not only will you have the right to force your friends to call you by your title, but you are helping to restore the Scottish countryside to its natural beauty. It's also just a great gift for any occasion. Please consider checking out Established Titles linked down below to not only make yourself a Laird or Lady, but to save the local ecosystem. But let's be honest, you just want the power. Get in there.
It's a company I could not be happier to work with, so check them out, and with that, let's get into the psychological dissonance of things we often don't feel so happy about being a part of, and that's politics. We've likely all experienced dissonance at some point, probably most of us as teenagers when we look back at some of our previous behavior or fashion choices and cringe. The feeling of uncomfortableness or cringe when our current beliefs or actions do not align with those that we have held or engaged in the past, that's dissonance. Specifically, Festinger 1957 identified the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance as a basic need for consistency as it applies to our knowledge, opinions, or beliefs about the world, or about ourselves. When there is a discrepancy between these cognitive factors, this creates discomfort, which we will inevitably seek to ameliorate. There are two general paths towards dissonance resolution, either through the addition of concordant cognitions to discredit the contradictory cognition by overwhelming it with a glut of information, all that favor the initial cognition, or by either decreasing the importance of the discordant cognitions or changing how the discordant information is processed. For example, if I think the Earth is flat and I'm confronted with information that contradicts that belief, such as information about Joe Biden traveling to Hyperborea, I can either go binge flat Earth videos to convince myself that my initial belief was accurate, or I can try to discredit the information I learned to the contrary about, Joe Biden's Hyperborean hollow Earth theory, which apparently is a real meme. However, the wealth of research on cognitive dissonance seems to indicate that we're more able to change our beliefs and opinions than our behaviors. And because voting is a behavior accompanied by associated beliefs and opinions, it may be an action uniquely affected by cognitive dissonance. Early research on voting and dissonance found that as a form of avoiding dissonant feelings, which we all seek to do because, again, dissonance is uncomfortable, beliefs about the success of a candidate are associated with the very act of voting, and further that reprocessing happens almost instantaneously after casting a vote. For example, Frankel and Doob 1976, across two experiments, surveyed Canadian voters as they entered and exited the polling booths in the 1971 Ontario provincial and 1972 federal Canadian election regarding their feelings on the quality of their chosen candidate and their anticipation that their chosen candidate would win. In both experiments, subjects were more likely to say that they believed their candidate would win and that their candidate was of a higher quality than when they had entered the polling station. The very act of voting then made these voters believe that their candidate was a better choice and was more likely to win. Reagan and Martin 1988 replicated this experiment in a sample of US voters before and after entering the voting booths for the 1984 presidential election between Ronald Reagan, likely no relation to researcher Dr. Dennis T. Reagan, and Walter Mondale. As with Frankel and Doob, they found that voters reported feeling as if their candidate was more likely to win after voting than they had beforehand. The researchers anticipated this feeling might be related to general increased optimism about the world on that particular day by polling them about their perception of the beautiful fall weather, but it was not, indicating that the act of voting in and of itself and its effects on our beliefs, as dissonance avoidance does not necessarily apply to our general view of the world. I do wish the researchers had been able to ask which candidate the subjects voted for, though, to produce this result, if only because the 1984 US presidential election was a brutal 525-13 electoral landslide victory for incumbent Ronald Reagan, who took every single state except Minnesota, wherein he only lost by less than 5,000 votes. Although just like Jeb, I believe Mondale can still win. In all seriousness though, I don't know if Mondale voters would have felt better after casting their vote for him in a national climate that was so clearly in favor of Reagan, who was beloved at the time, or at least for most Americans.
Why did black people distrust Ronald Reagan?
Because he was white?
That is correct.
Regardless, these two classic studies indicate that the very act of voting can make us believe that our guy or gal is more likely to win, likely due to that very act of casting the ballot, and the effects of behavioral consistency. After all, we voted for them, we can't be wrong, and if our candidate doesn't win, well, that can be psychologically uncomfortable because it would violate our behavioral anticipation and need for consistency. But what happens after the polls? Is there only a role of dissonance in choosing, or is there also a role of dissonance in losing? To get a better understanding of voting and dissonance over time, Beasley and Joslin 2001 utilized national election study data during the 1972, 1980, 84, 88, 1992, and 96 pre- and post-election periods in the United States to get a better idea of how people felt at various periods of time around the election. They found that in 5 out of the 6 elections assessed, abstaining from voting was the best way to reduce your dissonance, as regardless of whether one's preferred candidate won or lost, dissonance in latter evaluation was always higher for voters than for non-voters. Those who did not vote for the winner tended to depolarize from their political beliefs, maintaining their initial perceptions of both candidates. Polarization is a perception that the two candidates are very dissimilar. That is, when one's favored candidate wins the presidential election, the results are fairly consistent in that supporters of the winner will believe that winner was more dissimilar from the other candidate, while those who supported the loser will view both as more similar. Attitudes towards a candidate after elections were also dependent on who voters supported. Those whose preferred candidate won came to feel slightly more positive attitudes towards the losing candidate, as well as minimally more positive attitudes towards their own preferred candidate. In turn, those who supported a losing candidate came to have far more positive feelings towards the winner and majorly decreased in positive feelings towards their own preferred but losing candidate. That is, perhaps in order to avoid cognitive dissonance, voters choose to distance themselves from the losing candidate that they supported. However, this was not the case in every single election. Specifically, when Mondale lost to Reagan in 1984, subjects were most likely to reduce their dissonance, increasing their positive perceptions of Reagan, while in contrast, dissonance increased following the 1996 election race between Bill Clinton and Bob Dole.
I don't know where you get these figures, Bob, honestly.
Hillary, why don't you give it a rest? No one elected you to a damn thing.
The researchers suggested that how much dissonance voters feel when their preferred candidate loses is based on the absolute attractiveness of that candidate, such that when we see the winner as particularly unattractive, that results in more dissonance when we didn't vote for them. This was particularly the case for people who had less favorable opinions of both candidates, while it was irrelevant for non-voters who, again, didn't really experience any dissonance at all. That is, when people perceived both presidential candidates as relatively acceptable, they experienced lower levels of dissonance than those who found one option to be just absolutely unacceptable. Thus, absolute attractiveness was non-significant in 1992 when Bill Clinton, seen as the generally more attractive candidate, won over George H.W. Bush, when there was also an attractive third-party candidate in the form of Ross Perot, who himself earned 19% of the popular vote, splitting it.
So that's Detweiler's game, eh? Split the vote just like Wilson did back in the general election of 1912. Well, two can play at that game.
To summarize these findings, typically voters are drawn to the candidate that they find most attractive, and a third-party candidate can actually influence outcomes when both choices are seen as relatively equal in attractiveness, as Jo Jorgensen did in 2020 by taking 60,000 votes in Georgia that might otherwise have gone for Trump, potentially flipping the state in his favor. More important for current affairs, perhaps, is that when a preferred candidate loses, many people will disassociate with that candidate to avoid dissonance, while in turn, there is little increase in positive opinions towards a winning candidate that one has supported. There's a reason why we can't exactly apply these data to the last 2 US presidential elections, though, and that's because the authors threw out responses from voters who they said found neither candidate attractive. Thus, applying this study to the Trump-Biden election is a bit difficult because a lot of people despised Trump yet had no real love or positive opinion towards Biden either, besides the fact that he's just not Trump. If we were to apply these data, however, that would mean that people who voted for Biden will be more positive towards him just because they voted for him, in and of itself as a tendency of behavioral and belief consistency, despite not really necessarily wanting to do so. In turn, a lot of Trump supporters might have some decreased opinions of him following his failure in 2020. However, that doesn't appear to be the case. But then again, Trump as a president in and of himself is an anomaly somewhat. The data from Beasley and Joslin found that Reagan was also something of an anomaly, just in terms of how attractive he was seen as being by voters, and how in turn Mondale voters didn't seem to have any dissonance upon his loss, and only slightly more dissonance among Carter voters during the 1980 election against Reagan. But these were cases where the attractive candidate won, rather than Trump, who in very many ways is seen as a second coming of Reagan for a lot of people, and again, similarly was a star in his own right before ascending to the presidency. And yet Trump lost to, come on man, maybe not a less attractive candidate, but certainly a less interesting one in the form of Joe Biden. Hence, all of these data only apply to when the attractive candidate wins, whereby former supporters tend to distance themselves from that candidate to avoid dissonance, but says nothing about what happens when the attractive candidate loses. But of course, as I previously alluded to, a heck of a lot of people never saw Trump as an attractive candidate. Trump has spent the last 30-odd years building a reputation as a billionaire playboy and entered the political stage with zero concern for decorum, and he never adopted it.
I don't often agree with Marco, and I don't often agree with Ted, but I get along with everybody. But I say this every night, every day, every afternoon, and it's so true. Jet is a mess.
While a lot of people found those traits attractive, others obviously despised them. Yet at the same time, Hillary was also disliked by many, not only because many found her personality to be grating,
we came, we saw, he died,
but because her platform was based heavily on seemingly identity politics at best, and maybe is just hollow at worst, much like the Earth, where Hololive characters originate. What did Hillary Clinton even stand for except being the first woman president? I mean, that is when she could stand, of course.
Well, that was just plain rude.
But as such, for a lot of Americans, much as in 2020, 2016 felt like a choice between two unlikable candidates, something known as Morton's Fork, and put eloquently by South Park.
Welcome to the cable access televised debate between a giant douche and a turd sandwich.
But Morton's Fork was not assessed in the Beasley and Joslin analysis. So for more information, we can look to Eubanks et al. 2019, who surveyed subjects a week before and after the 2016 US presidential election. Subjects' degree of warmth towards both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton was assessed, as well as their degree of political acumen, education level, and political partisanship to account for general differences. In general, then, those who were more favorable towards both candidates viewed Trump as having more evaluative spread. That is, they viewed Trump as very different from Clinton, while those who disfavored both candidates felt Clinton was more similar to Trump. When asked after the election, those who preferred Trump but generally had more positive opinions towards both candidates specifically experienced very minor increased feelings of dissimilarity for Trump compared to Clinton. In turn, those who preferred Clinton but also did not hate Trump subsequently viewed Clinton as dissimilar from Trump. Those who liked both candidates but preferred Hillary viewed her as more similar to Trump after the election, while those who preferred Hillary but liked neither candidate viewed Hillary as more dissimilar from Trump. These data are indicative, then, that when our preferred candidate does not win out of two candidates that we like, we can perhaps explain to ourselves that the preferred one wasn't really that great and therefore the loss doesn't matter so much. In turn, when we dislike both, we are seemingly incentivized to then view the winner as vastly different from the loser. For some of those who supported Clinton as a product of dissonance, they likely explained to themselves that Trump and Clinton really weren't that dissimilar after all, and thus the loss was less important. That is, when our preferred candidate wins, our evaluation of both that candidate and the losing party remain mostly unchanged. But when our preferred candidate loses, we may want to disassociate ourselves from them or believe that that candidate is really nothing special. In turn, those who like neither candidate options are likely to increase in their perception that the winner or the loser is unique based on their own existing predispositions towards either unliked candidate. Voters with more positive views towards both candidates then usually explain to themselves why their preferred candidate won, while those who dislike both view their preferred candidate, who they again also dislike, as very dissimilar from the other candidate. Again, from the perspective of dissonance, this may be a way of explaining why the preferred candidate, out of two disliked options, lost. They were perhaps just too unique and too different to win. The scrutiny surrounding Trump, of course, only began with his 2016 electoral race, and dissonance can easily increase later on when the person we have voted for then goes on to do things that we disagree with, or which bring us personal shame. And the impeachments of Trump certainly may have done that for many people. Thus, Harmon Jones Denson and Harmon Jones, 2020, sought to understand how accusations against Trump influenced feelings of dissonance in his supporters and in Americans in general. In their first study, subjects were asked about their support of Trump, as well as their support of him in light of the accusations of his sexual misconduct, and were allowed to give open-ended responses regarding their support. The prompt only stated that Trump had been accused but gave no specifics. Like the fact that Lisa Bloom, the lawyer who represented two of his accusers, had also organized deals with outside donors to pay two other women hundreds of thousands of dollars to accuse Trump, or that Bloom would then go on to defend Harvey Weinstein a year later, but I digress. Answers were coded using inter-rater analysis to sort responses into 8 disparate categories, including economic, communication, competence, good character, not a politician, cares about America, politics and issues, or other. Nearly 30% of respondents said their reasons for supporting Trump were economic, while 21% supported him because they believed he was competent. 19% appreciated the way he dealt with the press and communicated. 19% liked him for some other reason, 18% believed he was a genuine person, 11% appreciated that he was not a politician, 10% believed he cared about America, and 8.6% cared about his policies outside of the economic. First of all, I think these findings are really interesting, if only for the fact that the reason the majority of Trump supporters said they liked the guy was because of his economic policies specifically, and because they thought he, as a billionaire probably, was likely more competent at handling economic issues, and not so much because they cared about his America First slogans, which many in the press and on the left have described as exclusionary. These rationales changed, however, for those exposed to information about Trump's alleged sex scandals. In general, support for Trump decreased for those who read about the scandals, but specifically, the comparative percentage of respondents who said that they supported Trump for economic reasons decreased by more than 10%, while those who said they supported him for communication and competence reasons, and because Trump was not a politician, all increased in percentile support. Interestingly, there was little decrease in beliefs about Trump's character, nor in his concerns about America when reading about the sex scandals. But there was a slight decrease in support of him due to his stances on other policies and issues beyond the economic. In terms of the justifications that subjects gave for why they continued their support of Trump after the sexual misconduct allegations, the majority, 52%, disbelieved the claims and instead believed them to be a result of media misinformation. In turn, 31% believed the accusations were likely true, but excused them as being typical of men in similar positions of wealth and power as Donald Trump, while 29% also believed the accusations were accurate, but insisted that his politics were more important than his personal life. Respondents were less likely to believe the allegations of sexual misconduct than other claims made in a more neutral article about Trump. Those who read a neutral article, however, believed that Trump's politics mattered more than those who read the sexual assault allegations, and were also more likely to believe that others commit similar deeds to Trump when reading an article not about the sexual misconduct allegations. This may make more sense when we take into consideration the fact that in this study, subjects were only told that Trump had been accused and were given no more details of the accusations. Even without being explicitly reminded of the specific instances of accusations of Trump's misconduct, say from adult entertainer Stormy Daniels, the majority of his supporters outright disbelieved these accusations, and those that did believe them gave rationales as to why they thought the alleged behavior wasn't so bad. That being said, I'm not sure if reminding subjects of the specifics of the Trump allegations would really have helped, given that, for example, in addition to Stormy herself, having to pay nearly $300,000 in lawyers' fees to Trump in her second suit against him, one of the lawyers who represented Stormy Daniels, who again was perhaps the biggest voice in speaking out about Trump's alleged sexual misconduct, Michael Avenatti, has been in his own hot water for stealing money from his clients. In fact, Avenatti was recently sentenced to 30 months in prison for attempting to extort not just women like Stormy Daniels, but Nike. This guy was living large, raking in cash and making dozens of appearances on CNN and other news programs, all while Stormy herself was being forced to work in strip clubs, by the way. I'm not sure about the veracity of the claims that Stormy made against Donald Trump, but I don't think she's going to get any justice for it at this point. However, I do hope she feels some sense of justice, knowing that sleazeball Michael Avenatti is going to go to prison for 2.5 years. Just pointing out that these were the results when subjects were not given the specifics of these allegations and the ramifications of the Trump sexual misconduct allegations. I would expect them to be a little bit different if people were reminded of the outcomes of those cases. A second study, though, was conducted in December 20th, 2019, 2 days after the first call to impeach Donald Trump. If you've forgotten, that impeachment was the result of accusations that Trump abused his power as president to withhold money from the Ukraine in exchange for information about none other than Joe Biden's son Hunter's dealings with Ukrainian business holdings group Burisma. That same investigation had previously been cut short after Joe Biden himself managed to negotiate the dismissal of the Ukraine's lead prosecutor, Viktor Shokin, to cease the investigation into his son, lest he use his own power as vice president at the time to withhold $1 billion in loans to the Ukraine. Just thought I'd remind you that the first time Trump was impeached, it was for looking into the Bidens, and in doing so was accused of abuse of power for, again, wanting more information about an instance where Joe Biden threatened another country that if they didn't fire a lawyer who was investigating his son, he wouldn't give them a loan. But again, this impeachment was about Trump's alleged abuse of power. And maybe it's just me, but I do find it just a little bit funny that both times the Democrats attempted to impeach Donald Trump, it was essentially a big no you.
Yes, I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
Don't think about it too hard, man. I mean, come on, man, you know the thing.
Go, you know the thing.
Anyway, back to the study, because that's why we're here, and I don't think that even Surfshark VPN, which you can get 83% off of by using code AIDEN, can protect me from continuing to talk about the Biden family scandals. Subjects read a statement about the impeachment, and then some also read about the sex scandal allegations, and subsequently rated their favorability towards Trump and answered open-ended questions about their support, which were, again, coded by inter-rater analysis. Once again, the majority, 37% of respondents, said their reasons for supporting Trump were based on his economic policies, followed by 34.7% who supported his policies in general, 20.8% who believed in his competence, and 19.7% who believed he had a good character. Once again, those who did not read about the sex scandals were generally more positive towards Trump. However, compared to the first study, those who read about the sex scandals were more supportive of Trump's economic policies and his policies in general. Those who did not read about the sex scandals were more likely to report that they felt Trump received unfair treatment. After Trump's impeachment, comparatively, subjects were very slightly less likely to disbelieve accusations of misconduct or to excuse his actions by suggesting that others do similar things as Trump. Meanwhile, belief that his policies mattered more than his personal life was stable between both studies, while instead, the percentage of those whose excuses for Trump could not be easily categorized nearly doubled. Compared to the first experiment, before the impeachment, subjects were generally less likely to say that Trump's personal life was not important, only when they had also not read about the sex scandal, and when they had, were more insistent that his personal life was unimportant. After impeachment, whether or not respondents were reminded of the alleged misconduct, their percentile support for the idea that others behaved similarly to Trump as an excuse for his actions was lower than the measure taken before impeachment. There was no real significant difference between those who read about the sex scandal and those who did not after the impeachment. That is, people who already liked Trump actually kind of came to support him more, at least in terms of his economic policies after the first impeachment process began, and the main reason they gave for that was precisely because they supported his policies while they continued to believe that his personal life was unimportant compared to his actions in office. Instead, Trump supporters did cease to justify his actions as normative after the impeachment comparatively. Interestingly, after the impeachment, more respondents reported that they believed Trump cared about America and that he was concerned with policies and issues. These data could be easily interpreted, and I think quite reasonably interpreted, as a dissonance reaction to the negative information about Donald Trump, which manifested as increased support for him, particularly in the realm of his practical capacity as president, rather than in his personal life. I see no logical reason why the same phenomenon could not be present in Biden voters. It's not just possible, but probable, that when Biden does something really embarrassing, those who voted for him feel a sense of dissonance, and would actually maybe end up being more supportive of Biden. Although, it is worth talking about that a recent study from Trafalgar Group found that a third of Biden voters don't think he's actually in charge of the presidency, essentially, while only 11% of Republicans think he is. Make of that all what you will, but it seems to me that even Biden voters don't think he's really so responsible. But I digress. Yes, when Biden stumbles and can barely manage to form a sentence, I bet there are people out there that go, "You bet your butt that's why I wanted this guy in office." And I say that precisely because that's what Trump voters did when Trump was caught in scandals and embarrassing situations. We, myself included, may have made excuses for a lot of it, but Trump also had, and still has, a lot of clearly very dedicated, fanatically so even, fan and voter bases. Even now, when we're not in the election cycle, and much of the country is still locked down, and with everything that happened on January 6th, people are still showing up in droves to go to his rallies. Meanwhile, what does a Biden speaking event look like? So, despite the fact that nobody seems that fired up about Biden, he got the most votes in US history, and that too may be a product of dissonance in the form of negative voting. That he was elected by a country that didn't actually care about him or like him, they just despised the other dude. Ganton Davis, 1984, initially defined negative voting as an action that occurs, quote, when a citizen is neutral towards A, but disliked the opposing candidate B. A negative voter therefore does not like his or her preferred candidate. Rather, the negative voter is motivated by antipathy towards the opposition. He or she votes against, not for. Negative voting can extend from voting for an individual candidate into general negative partisanship, which similarly to negative voting describes the tendency for some people to continually support a political party not because they actually like that party and its members, but because they have very negative feelings about the opposing party. And I think that's pretty much everyone in the US at this point on either side of the aisle to some degree. I mean, you think I like voting for Republicans? Well, the last one I voted for was Kim Klacik, so yeah, I actually did like that.
I'm Kim Klacik, and I'm running for Congress because I actually care about Black lives. All Black lives matter. Our communities matter. Baltimore matters. And Black people don't have to vote Democrat.
Go to horny jail.
But plenty of people feel seemingly forced to vote for a party representative that they don't like and they don't care for just because they might experience dissonance to vote for someone from the opposing side. Thus, negative partisanship predicts that even when both options are equally unlikable, we vote with our partisan orientation, which likely creates less dissonance than if we voted for the opposite party. The potential for negative partisanship is particularly important to understand in recent US politics, given that partisanship has been on the rise steadily since the early 1970s, as seen in analysis from Aramovich and Webster 2015. Even the few independents that are left have moved considerably to generally vote for one party or the other, and this too has increased over time, such that while in the 1970s, independents and weak partisans voted for one party or the other only about half of the time, by 2012 that had increased to 70% consistency of voting pattern behaviors. Aramovich and Webster proposed that this was likely due to increased feelings of positive partisanship, that is, positive feelings towards one's own political group, accompanied with decreased feelings towards the opposite political group. But that wasn't really what they found. Instead, preference for the political in-group remained relatively stable, while negative partisanship towards the out-group political party increased as positive feelings for them decreased. This was so both for Democrats and Republicans. Partisanship in voting consistently increased over time, most for those who had negative feelings towards the opposing party, not those who liked their own party, while for those who were more positive or neutral towards the other political group, voting was less consistent and more easily influenced by individual candidates and election cycles. Out of this kind of negative partisanship has evolved a feeling of dissonance, about just not wanting to vote for the other party because we dislike that party, perhaps on principle. And that has led to a major change in US politics more broadly outside of the White House. As well, in the 1970s, the party of the president did not necessarily coincide with an increased representation in the House of that same party, particularly for Republicans. But by 2012, for both Democrats and Republicans, there was a 90% consistency between House winners and the party of the sitting president. This kind of throws a spanner in the whole checks and balances thing. It's an obvious result of dissonance as political parties have essentially become team sports. Therefore, when a Democrat moves into Pennsylvania Ave, Democrat voters become more motivated to also vote for the House to avoid Republicans getting in, and Republicans do the same right back so that, elephant or donkey, one party typically controls US politics at any one time, and they're just trading off based on voter feelings of not wanting to be like the other dude. This results in these data, from 2014 mind you, that found that during a Democrat presidential administration, there is a 95% chance of a Democrat being elected to the House in a more Democrat-leaning district, while there's a 93% chance of a Republican being elected to the House during a Republican administration in a more Republican-leaning district. The negative partisanship dissonance has become so strong then as to basically guarantee who wins the House based on who won the presidency. This shift has also created strong state-based political segregation, as Aramovich and Webster found that the party of the president in primarily Democrat states predicted a Democrat Senate winner more than 90% of the time, and in Republican states, a Republican winner about 78% of the time. Not only does this turn states into partisan entities that almost always vote one way or another, as previously stated, this has become a weird handoff where Democrats rule for 8 years, then Republicans, with each side coming to hate the other more and more and more every 8 years, and creates cognitive dissonance in voters who would even consider betraying their tribe, all based on the party affiliation of the president first and foremost. Moreover, voters seem to like their chosen party and its leaders or candidates no differently than they did in the past, but have come to dislike rival parties more over time. The ultimate result of the nationalization of local US politics is that whoever controls the presidency controls the House and the Senate, with increasing frequency due to, it seems, increased feelings of intergroup animosity and dissonance regarding voting. Thus, what we see is a lot of negative partisanship, of voting against the side we dislike rather than voting for the side we like, or at least supposedly.
I hate you.
I hate you too.
Fuck off doesn't mean go away. Fuck off means fuck off.
Bankert 2020 sought to understand negative and positive partisanship specifically in the context of the 2016 presidential election to measure how feelings of dissonance regarding wishing to differentiate the self from another political party influenced voting behavior. He found that those who were high in negative partisanship towards the outgroup were also anti-bipartisan, believing the Democrat and Republican parties were incompatible. This means that, it seems at least, people who don't know much about politics tend to be the most partisan, particularly during the election season. But in the 2016 election specifically, Clinton voters were mostly driven to vote for her out of positive partisanship towards the Democrats, while negative partisanship against Republicans was non-significant in influencing votes. That was not the case for Trump voters, who were equally affected by both positive and negative partisanship. That is, one reason why Trump likely won in 2016 is people were seemingly tired of 8 years of Democrat control, and thereby the disdain felt towards Democrats, and especially Hillary Clinton, might have motivated even reluctant members of the Republican Party to vote for Donald Trump just because he wasn't a Democrat and he wasn't Hillary Clinton. This carried into intentions to vote in the 2018 House election, wherein for both Democrats and Republicans, negative partisanship was a significant predictor of voting for the in-party candidate, as was ideological strength. But in 2018, Republicans reported more positive partisanship, while Democrats reported less. Again, all of this is evidence that the two parties are handing off the keys back and forth every couple years, and each time dissonance about violating the party norms, changing feelings of positive and negative partisanship based on whose party is in charge, seems to be the status quo. In an attempt to avoid dissonance and vote against party norms, the US then has not only become increasingly partisan, but partisan based seemingly almost entirely on whomever is in the White House at the time. Who is president then has become far more than just being commander-in-chief. It has become a celebrity position that affects all politics. And Trump wasn't the first Hollywood celebrity to be president after all. As mentioned before, Ronald Reagan was. But US presidents have always been not just a little bit larger than life, but larger than their individual parties for a long time. And that might be part of the way that Americans mythologize our presidents. Our Washingtons, our Jeffersons, our Lincolns, our Roosevelts, and of course, our Millard Fillmores. We personalize them as representations of the nation, and this tendency to personalize leaders and how that tendency interacts with negative partisanship was assessed by Garcia and De Silva, 2021, not in the US, but in 14 other parliamentary democracies in Europe. They proposed that while personalization, being seen as a representation of political action in human form, generally is a good thing for a politician, there can also be negative personalizations, wherein the politician, the face of the party, damages it, again perhaps as a function of dissonance, of wanting to distance the self from that party's face, and in doing so, that politician damages the party as well. We libertarians are well aware of what that looks like.
Raise. If you refuse, I'll haunt your prostate.
They found that, in general, cynicism towards politicians in Europe has steadily increased over time, with fewer positive evaluations of leaders across the board between 1960 and 2020. As expected, subjects always reported liking candidates who came from their own in-group party more than out-party leaders. But liking decreased unilaterally. As expected, respondents viewed a leader from their favored party as more personable, and they experienced more negative personalization towards out-party leaders. In their full model analysis, they found that negative personalization, again, which is a feeling that the candidate was unpersonable, was not a product of stronger party identifications. That is, it is unlikely that the reason people disliked Hillary Clinton was exclusively because she was a Democrat. And the same is true for Donald Trump being a Republican, which really, he barely was. Additionally, negative personalizations were unrelated to ideological divergences between voters and the leaders' parties. Again, meaning that you can absolutely dislike Joe Biden, but still like the Democrat Party and remain a Democrat. Earlier in history, positive personalizations were more influential than were negative personalizations. But over the years, negative personalization has become more potent. As such, it just seems that politics across the world has become more about hating politicians rather than liking them. But even when we dislike a given candidate that represents our favored party, we can separate that individual from the party. Tony Blair potentially could have harmed the reputation of Labour for years, but many were able to separate Blair from Labour, which in turn is probably part of the reason for the changes in the Labour Party.
Why does the government not consider legal action to be necessary in the case of Belarus?
What is the legal action that you're proposing?
A few moments later.
I'm asking you the question.
Yes, I'm trying to clarify.
Does the government consider legal action to be necessary at all?
Sorry, forgive me. What I was trying to clarify is who do you want us to sue and where?
I love my job.
That is, cognitive dissonance allows us to separate a leader from the wider social group identity. Garcia and De Silva 2021b conducted a similar analysis, focusing their attention specifically on the 2020 US presidential election and the concept of negative voting. Subjects were asked about their political affiliation and strength of affiliation with either party, and then were asked why they had voted for their chosen candidate. Specifically, if they voted for Biden either because they supported him or because they disliked Trump, and vice versa for Trump voters. The percentage of negative votes skewed clearly towards the Democrats. Many Republicans voted against Joe Biden, of course, but far more Democrats of any degree of affiliation with the party voted for Joe Biden specifically because they disliked Donald Trump. Positive voters who voted either for Trump or for Biden and not against either man were about equal in reported degree that they loved their own party and hated the other party, while negative voters had very little love for their own party. Similarly, positive voters were about equal in their perceptions of loving their in-group candidate and hating the out-group candidate. But negative voters had no love for their in-group candidate, while really despising the out-group candidate. Recalling that this is a tendency that's skewed to the left, the data can be interpreted such that a lot of Democrats did not vote for Joe Biden.
Please don't make me vote for Joe Biden! Please don't make me vote for Joe Biden!
But rather because they just couldn't stand Donald Trump. And all of that makes a lot of sense. The media, professional and social, was scathing towards Trump for years and portrayed him as a big orange, World War II baddie. the probability that a voter who reported loving their own candidate only marginally more than they hated the opponent would cast a negative vote in spite of the other candidate was less than 20%. That is, we generally have to really hate the other guy to vote just out of spite. Voting in spite? Are we really becoming the thing that we fear the most?
People who are intolerant of other people's cultures and the Dutch.
In these data, this was the case both for Trump and for Biden voters. Either had to really detest the other candidate to cast a negative vote. And I mean, what strong feelings do most people have about Joe Biden, who seems to be bumbling around, stumbling into deals with the Ukraine and Mexico via his son, eating ice cream and talking about Corn Pop?
And Corn Pop was a bad dude.
Okay, Grandpa, we'll be sure to keep that in mind.
Well, on the other hand, there's Satan incarnate. I mean, come on, man. If you can't see who the obvious target for a negative vote is in that scenario, then you ain't black. But again, that does not mean that we like the candidate we voted for. And here, again, is where dissonance plays a role. If we can convince ourselves that we need to vote against someone who is literal Hortlor, we don't actually need to support the guy that we're voting for to avoid dissonant feelings, at least in the moment. So, when we're feeling dissonant when our candidate loses, even if we only voted for them out of spite for the opponent, how does the installation of that candidate into the presidency affect our attitudes? A master's thesis from Able 2020 investigated this question by utilizing data from the American National Election Survey between 1948 and 2016 that included a feeling thermometer used to gauge Americans' feelings towards their presidents, specifically first-term presidents. This leaves her analysis with Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, and Donald Trump. She found that having voted for a loser resulted both in decreased and increased polarization. That is, as we saw before, some will tend to dump their chosen candidate, decreasing in their favorability to reduce dissonance, while also increasing their favorability towards the winner. To minimize psychological discomfort, we tell ourselves that the winner can't really be that bad of a guy, and that our preferred candidate wasn't really that great. In contrast, when we voted for the winner, we can also depolarize by admitting that the other candidate was fine enough, just not our preferred one. Looking to specific elections, in the 1980, 1988, and 1992 elections, while there was increased depolarization for those who voted for the losing party. So specifically, those who did not vote for Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, or Clinton, and instead voted for the other candidates in those elections, so Jimmy Carter, Michael Dukakis, who is perhaps most memorable for being the target of one of the most unrepentantly savage attack ads ever produced.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
And then, somewhat deservedly, George H.W. Bush himself. All came to be more positive in their evaluations towards the winner and less positive in their evaluations towards the person that they voted for when they voted for that loser. Understandably, this effect was smaller in the 1992 election when then-incumbent H.W. Bush was running against Clinton. Things changed, however, before the Fire Nation attacked in 2000 before the election of Bush Jr., wherein polarization increased for both Bush voters and Al Gore voters. But specifically, polarization increased for Bush voters. That is, people who voted for George Bush had lower opinions of Al Gore after the election than they did before, as did Gore voters, albeit to a slightly smaller degree. This could, of course, though, be due to Al Gore's increasing fear of the melting ice wall unleashing the Hyperboreans onto the rest of Earth.
The prophecy is true.
In 2008, Obama voters were slightly more polarized, being less favorable towards John McCain, while McCain voters became very depolarized, being more accepting of Obama and less fond of McCain after his loss. Comparatively to the Obama and Bush Jr. elections, polarization change in 2016 was fairly minimal, with Trump voters being slightly more positive towards Trump and less positive towards Hillary, and Hillary voters depolarizing somewhat to distance themselves from her, which is always a good idea when it comes to the Clintons. In 2 of the 3 instances wherein polarization increased, the race was also very close, both between Trump and Hillary and between Bush and Gore. Although the 2008 race between Obama and McCain was a massacre, and yet also produced increased polarization. But in general, the findings seem to be indicative that to cope with dissonance, it is not so much that we will come to love the winner, but that we will disassociate with the loser, and that allows us to be more accepting of a political figure whom we did not support after the loss of our preferred candidate. In the close years of 2016 and 2000, 2 years after the election, favorability towards the winner from those who voted for the losing candidate were far more negative than in other years, indicating that there will be more people who will remain unfavorable towards a president when the legitimacy of that win is called into question. In those same years, positive feelings towards the loser also increased after 2 years, while in other elections, feelings towards the loser either decreased or remained mostly neutral. Thus, in close elections, or again when there are questions about the process, as there was in the 2000 election and the 2016 one, the typical avoidance of dissonance that we usually see in voters by distancing themselves from the losing candidate is not always present. In regards specifically to the Electoral College, when the college did not supersede the popular vote, such as is the case in most elections, favorability toward the loser decreased, while it increased for the winner. In turn, in cases such as the 2016 and 2000 elections, when the winner was determined by the Electoral College and not by the popular vote, those who voted for the loser were more favorable towards said loser, while those who voted for the winner were less favorable towards the losing candidate. Obviously, though, that's not what happened for a lot of people in the 2016 election. They did not become more positive towards Trump and less positive towards Hillary. Instead, many claimed that the entire system was rigged, and then spent the next 4 years or so demanding more and more investigations into the 2016 election, something that we also saw in reaction to the results of the 2020 election. So we need to further understand how we feel after an election when we believe, realistically or not, that an election was not entirely fair, as many did in 2016. So how does our vote affect our perception that an election was legitimate, given that when our candidate doesn't win, that creates psychological discomfort and dissonance? For answers, we can look first to Sanses and Stewart, 2015, who studied voting perceptions in U.S. elections since the year 2000 through 2012, utilizing national voter confidence data. Between 2000 and 2007, Republicans were very confident in the accuracy of national voting integrity, while Democrats were generally less confident. Specifically, Democrats believed there was a major issue in integrity when polled in 2007. This is a bit paradoxical because in 2006, the Democrats picked up 31 seats in the House, 5 seats in the Senate, and 6 gubernatorial positions. They swept that year's elections. It's the year Nancy Pelosi became Speaker. Yet the following year, they reported decreased perceptions of the integrity of the U.S. election system. Their confidence increased after the 2008 election of Barack Obama, however, while in comparison, Republicans' confidence decreased. And interestingly, both Democrats and Republicans' confidence in the system decreased again in 2012 after Obama's second term began, although the Democrat decrease was minor compared to that of Republicans. When compared to all voters who were not staunch partisans, however, both Democrats and Republicans were consistently lower in their perception of voting accuracy over time, but even general voter perceptions of accuracy of elections began to plummet after 2012. Maybe that's because the 2012 election was a terrible choice between which shade of dude you wanted to drone strike Arabic people, but I digress. In terms of levels of confidence about the nation at large, confidence in one's own vote efficacy increased after the election only when that vote was for the winner, while votes for the loser decreased the perception that voting really mattered at all, and that was the case in all 4 national elections assessed. In terms of party, state, and national differences, Democrats were always more confident in the system at large than were Republicans, but particularly when they comprised the majority vote. This was slightly different in state elections in that Republicans were only more confident in the security of their own vote when they vastly outnumbered the Democrats. However, at the presidential level, again, Democrats were far more confident in the outcomes of national elections than were Republicans. In terms of individual elections, in 2004, subjects increased in their confidence about the system over time, regardless of whether Bush or Kerry won. But in 2008, those who voted for the winner, Barack Obama, increased in their belief both in the integrity of their own vote and in the integrity of the vote of the nation, while those who voted for McCain came to believe the integrity of the national vote was lower. There was little change in the 2012 election for any group except Romney voters, who again came to view the national vote as being slightly lower in integrity. Looking to dissonance can provide us with some answers as to why this was the case. When our preferred candidate loses, we can tend to lose faith in the voting system. And if anyone knows loss of integrity when they see it, well, it's probably Mitt Romney. But when our candidate wins, we see the system as more secure. However, there are some differences in that Democrats, at least up until 2012, generally believed that the national voting system was very secure and expressed more confidence in it than did Republicans. But then what happened in 2016? Well, I'm sure you're all well aware of what happened in 2016, which suddenly reduced the certainty that Democrats had previously expressed in national elections comparatively to Republicans from 2000 to 2012. But let's look at that more closely in a study from Sinclair, Smith & Tucker 2018, who studied perceptions of the 2016 election as being unfair. These data, which were collected from the American Panel Survey, which measured confidence in the voting process over time, found that between 2014 and 2016, those who were Trump supporters generally reported less confidence in voting than did Hillary Clinton supporters, up until November of 2016, wherein degrees of confidence were about equal. And by December of 2016, when Trump had definitively won, confidence for Trump voters increased to unprecedented levels, while it decreased to unprecedented levels for Clinton supporters. Clinton supporters were more prone towards partisanship, but less prone towards conspiracism, at least at first. However, their belief in conspiracies involved in voting increased over time, while Trump voters' belief decreased. Strong Democrat partisans were the ones most likely to express significant decreases in their level of confidence in the system following Clinton's loss, while more rural Trump voters increased in their confidence in the system. Although even after his win, less educated Trump voters actually decreased in their confidence towards voting as a whole. All Democrats lost confidence in the system in 2016, but those who strongly identified with the Democrat Party lost more confidence than those who only mildly identified with the party, while strong Republican identifiers gained confidence. So it does seem that Democrats have a lot of faith in the voting system until they lose, whereas Republicans used to be more confident in voting, but have become far less so over time. Just as with 2020, the 2016 presidential election was marred with controversy. In 2016, with the allegations of Russian hacking, were very scandalous around the time following the election, such that when specifically controlling for the hacking story, Clinton supporters were moderately less confident in the US voting apparatus. And this was particularly potent in Clinton supporters who were more partisan towards the Democrats. For Trump supporters, those with less education were also less confident in the context of the hacking story, while those from more rural areas were actually more confident, perhaps thinking that their regions were unassailable by Russians.
Get out of here, stalker.
Considering that allegations of interference also marred the 2020 election, we could probably apply some of these data to the right as well. But until we do have more data, that's just speculation. We could reasonably assume that when similar accusations of misconduct were levied in the 2020 elections towards the left, it would be more partisan Trump supporters who would be less likely to be confident in the security of their votes. And that does appear to be the case, as a survey published from Reuters in April of 2021 found that 55% of Republicans believed the election was rigged, and that 38% strongly agreed with the statement that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. But that's all kind of obvious prima facie, isn't it? My point in bringing this all up is to show how Democrats, who typically were more confident in the voting system, at least comparatively to Republicans by 2012, just dropped that belief in 2016. It's perhaps not surprising then, while it may seem dissonant to Republicans and Trump voters, why so many of the same people have now since expressed belief that elections are very safe. But again, when considering psychological dissonance, this actually kind of makes sense. Considering that the Democrats are generally and historically have been more likely to be confident in elections, the 2016 election, which they were not confident in, created psychological dissonance, and now they may be experiencing a return to what they see as normalcy, even in support of a guy that we know they're not necessarily so fond of. But his win helped to reduce that dissonance, that presidential elections can result in some bombastic orange reality star becoming president. But if it has confused you as to why the same authors at the same media outlets that claimed the 2016 election was hacked by Russians now also claim that the 2020 election was solid as a rock, well, friends, that's cognitive dissonance. all based on whether or not their team won or lost, specifically when they had invested themselves into that team emotionally. Generally speaking then, it seems that we are willing to change our opinions towards a candidate or party when they lose or when they win, specifically by playing off that it really wasn't that important to us, or at least that used to be the case. But it seems that as polarization has increased in US politics, so too has an unwillingness to distance the self from a candidate, particularly after the 2016 election, and considering the 2020 election also involved Donald Trump, who is, again, holding popular rallies. It seems that many people are unwilling to change their minds about him and disassociate to avoid psychological dissonance. So are Republicans or Democrats more or less prone to changing their decisions about voting behavior then? So far it seems, in the data, to be a bit of a mixed bag. But again, Trump is an anomaly, and one that occurred as partisanship has risen to unprecedented levels in the United States. To understand feelings of post-election voting regret and perceptions that people essentially need social permission to vote differently in the future, we can then look to Levine 2021. The study was conducted in the summer of 2020, when it was fairly clear that Joe Biden would be the Democrat nominee for the election later that year. Michigan State University students were asked if they felt any pressure to vote for a particular political party, either because that's how their family typically votes, or because that's just how they thought they should vote, and if they felt any general obligations to vote for one party or the other, and the general importance they placed on needing permission for one's actions. They were also asked if they regretted previous votes made in 2016 when applicable. Women and Democrats were both more likely to say that they regretted their votes than men and Republicans, but were more likely to believe that it was acceptable to change their minds and not remain consistent with the party affiliation of one's vote. Further, there was a negative relationship between the belief that one need ask permission to make a decision about politics and the belief that one can change their mind at any point of time for any reason. And most people in this sample did not believe that they needed to be consistent with their voting patterns. Specifically, these findings are indicative that people who regret their votes are more likely to change their vote in the future when they are given social permission to do so. That's certainly not going to be the case for a lot of Republicans or independents now, is it? When there is so little social permission for it to be okay publicly to say that you voted for Trump or really anyone but Joe Biden, that in and of itself makes it a social requirement to vote for Joe Biden to be normative. And I think based on these data, we will find a dogmatism towards supporting Joe Biden even from people who don't believe they had a choice in voting for him, and they are unlikely to change that vote in the future, not only due to dissonance because they already voted for him once, but just due to a perception of a lack of social acceptance for any aberrant behavior to not vote for Joe Biden. You have to vote for this guy, otherwise the orange man wins, and you wouldn't want that now, would you? This is a self-perpetuating system wherein a lot of young people probably don't like who they're voting for. They just do so because they are pressured into doing so, and then psychologically become motivated to maintain internal consistency by continuing to vote for the same party and the same people. And who does this cycle seemingly affect the most by inducing regret? Well, it seems that it's women and Democrats, who likely don't feel that they can vote differently. In terms of the open-ended responses which were gathered in this study, most subjects said that they voted based on the individual person and not based on the party in 2016. For those who said they felt obligated to vote one way or another, subjects mentioned being afraid of being ostracized from their families or a feeling of being intrinsically drawn towards one party or the other. 18 respondents used the precise term obligation without prompting, either stating that they felt no such obligation to vote consistently for one party or the other, or that they were morally obligated to vote for one party or the other. These are all seemingly kind of uplifting statements that indicate young people believe that the candidate matters over the party. However, when asked under what circumstances they would be willing to vote for a candidate from another party, 19% said they would never do so under any circumstances. This was not a response unique to Biden voters, as some Trump-supporting participants also indicated that nothing would stop them from voting for Trump. But when we look at the example given of why one participant said their mind absolutely could not be changed, it was in the context that they would never ever vote for Trump, while another respondent reported that there was nothing anyone could say or do to stop them from voting for Trump either. Again, evidence of negative voting patterns, specifically regarding the orange man. Therefore, while it may be that Democrats may be more likely to regret their votes, and there seems to be some evidence that Democrats did tend to hate vote against Trump rather than Republicans did against Hillary, we need to further understand how political ideology influences dissonance, and because there were so many emotions involved in the 2016 and 2020 elections, and Trump in general, we can further understand this by going back to a study from Nam, Jost, and Bavel, 2013, who studied this across 2 experiments. In their first experiment, subjects were asked if they preferred Obama or George W. Bush in terms of their performance as president, as well as if they preferred Macs or PCs. Participants were then asked to write an essay either in support of Bush or Obama, or in support of either Macs or PCs, such that those who said that they preferred Barack Obama were asked to write a positive essay about George Bush, and those who said that they preferred Macs were asked to write a positive essay about PCs. Subjects in the high choice condition were given the option to refuse writing the essay, while those in the low choice condition were simply told that the essay was a required part of the experiment. Finally, subjects' self-reported political ideology was assessed, which produced expected results, in that those who identified as conservatives were more supportive of George Bush, and people who identified as less conservative were more supportive of Obama. Also, seemingly obvious, those who were given a choice to write a counter-attitudinal essay about a politician that they disliked were far less likely to write one than those not given a choice. But hang on, because that doesn't mean that those forced to write a positive essay about their non-preferred politician actually did so. Because some still wrote a negative essay about that person even when instructed to be positive, a manifestation of psychological reactance. In other words, those who really hated Bush and were forced to write a positive essay about him still wrote a nasty essay about Bush, but Bush supporters were actually more likely to write negative essays about Obama than were Obama supporters to write negatively about Bush, failing to comply with the instructions. When given a choice, all Bush supporters just flat out refused to write a positive essay about Obama, and were generally less, albeit non-significantly less, willing to write an essay about either Macs or PCs, regardless of whether or not they had a choice to do so. There are a couple of things that we could glean from these data as it applies to Bush supporters, but it seems that they are less willing to engage in dissonant action, and therefore may be more affected by the discomfort of dissonance than were Obama supporters. If we were to apply this to the Trump-Biden divide along the same lines of Republican versus Democrat, it's possible that Democrats don't suffer from dissonance as strongly as Republicans do, and are more willing to go along then with something they don't really believe in than are Republicans. Or it may be that Democrats feel just as much dissonance, but are generally more compliant and agreeable towards a request that would similarly induce dissonance in Republicans. And Big Five personality research does seem to indicate that Democrats do tend to be more agreeable. To apply this again to the real world, it's possible that Democrats are more amicable to the idea of voting for someone they don't really like just because they have been instructed to do so by an authority figure, such as a researcher. But because Obama was the current president when this study was conducted, and he was running for re-election, the researchers believed that could have influenced respondents' answers and behaviors. Specifically, Obama supporters, because their candidate was in a current position of power, were potentially more willing to write positively about Bush in retrospect than Bush supporters were to write about Obama presently. Thus, in a second study, the researchers attempted to remove some of this potential bias by questioning subjects about prior presidents Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, both of whom served 2 terms, were generally viewed positively in the polls, and, well, were both old white guys. Respondents indicated which of the 2 they believed was a more effective president, and which type of beverage they preferred, tea or coffee. They were then, as before, asked to write a positive essay, either about their non-preferred beverage or about the less effective president. The study was conducted in the US, as in the UK, the civic penalty for choosing anything but India's finest can lead to severe punishment.
1, 2, 3, 4, everything stops on T.
But we're just doing our job, aren't we, lads?
Once again, as expected, people who described themselves as more conservative were more supportive of Reagan, while those who described themselves as less conservative were more supportive of Clinton. And once again, the same tendency of conservatism towards compliance appeared. That is, those who favored Reagan were significantly less likely to write a positive essay about Clinton when given a choice, and not significantly when given no choice. Although unlike in the Obama-Bush experiment, at least some of the conservatives did agree to write something positive about Clinton this time. But while those more favorable of Reagan were less likely to write something positive about Clinton when forced to do so, this was unrelated to reports of personal political identification. Thus it seems that perhaps it's not Republicans, but people who just tend to support more conservative candidates who tend to be less willing to do or say things that they don't believe in just because an authority figure told them to, compared to supporters of less conservative candidates. Once again, this is perhaps evidence that people who tend to vote Democrat are more willing to undergo some cognitive dissonance when they are being instructed to do so by someone in a position of power, or it could be that Democrats are just more agreeable and more willing to comply. But as for the authority aspect, when the media at large, with the exception of Fox News, is encouraging the entire US population to despise one political figure, is it any real surprise then that people who tend to vote Democrat would go along with the pleadings of the same supposedly authoritative outlets and vote against that despised figure? Not because they like the opposition, but just because they were told to do so. Even if it wasn't something that they actually believed in deeply with ideological conviction, but rather because they are agreeable and are trying to be better people from their own perspective. And that in and of itself might produce dissonance when then subsequently the guy they did vote for says incredibly embarrassing things, like confusing the Tuskegee Airmen with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It seems then perhaps that those who vote Democrat may be more susceptible to coercion and less susceptible to the effects of dissonance, if not feelings of dissonance by engaging in behavior that they simply don't agree with just because it's being prescribed by an authority figure, then perhaps just a desire to be congenial. Besides, we all know that the only thing that the Tuskegee Airmen and syphilis have in common is that they're both extremely dangerous to the German nobility. Another possibility is that in both experiments, subjects were asked to write these essays in support of politicians they disliked based on the proposition that there was a lack of existing essays in support of that politician. And that might have caused supporters of conservative candidates to be less willing to provide support for someone that they think has none. However, that alternative hypothesis doesn't seem to align with the other data we've looked at so far that indicate the left, at least currently, tends to potentially be more influenced by social norms. And although conservatives have been found to be generally more conformist in previous studies, such as Cavazza and Mochifina, 2008, it was support for particular conservative candidates rather than general political ideology that predicted this lack of willingness to engage in dissonant behavior by writing an essay in support of a candidate one did not actually support. That is, Trump voters are not necessarily staunch conservatives and therefore can't really be compared to rhino candidates or typical conservatives that previous data have seemed to indicate tend to be more socially rigid and more prone to agree with authority.
Please clap.
Well, then in terms of public support for a candidate, it seems political ideology plays a role in dissonance in that those who vote for Republicans may be less willing to engage in dissonance-inducing actions by writing positive messages towards a political figure that they do not support. But the age of the voter also likely plays a role here. For as many have intimated, if you're not left-leaning when you're 20, then you have no heart, and if you're not a conservative by 30, then you have no head. And when there are so many young people who grew up under the 4 years of constant Trump derision who were able to vote for the first time in 2020 and voted overwhelmingly for Biden, we should probably look about how the ability to vote influences dissonance, which we can in data from Mullainathan and Washington, 2006, who examined changes in opinions towards voting behavior and support for a candidate in individuals before and after they turned 18 and became eligible to vote in the United States between 1978 and 1994. Those who were eligible to vote were more polarized in their opinions towards the president than those unable to vote, which is pretty clear evidence that the very act of voting seems to increase polarization, which we've looked at before, but likely in the form of dissonance and differentiation from others. The researchers found similar increased polarization in young people who were eligible to vote for senators and congresspeople compared to those ineligible. This increase in polarization was present in a presidential election year and a non-presidential election year. The major finding here is perhaps that even having the ability to vote makes us more prone towards dissonance and ultimately through dissonance to polarization, whereas when we don't vote or can't vote, there's less reason to feel dissonance, even if we are concerned with politics. So, as there were millions of young people voting for the first time in 2020, after years of many likely being concerned with politics under the Trump administration, because politics were inescapable in pop culture during that time, and for that reason likely did cast their vote for Joe Biden, To now have to watch Joe Biden's constant gaffes, that could perhaps create dissonance and political polarization in those young people, all as a psychological function to reduce dissonance and increase psychological well-being. So, because we've seen over and over again that there is a connection between voting and dissonance, and because 2016 and 2020 were both years with a lot of negative votes simply against the opposing party and not for the preferred candidate, a phenomenon known as tactical voting, how does tactical voting influence feelings of dissonance? Again, since so many people previously uninvolved in politics became involved and registered to vote in 2020, with many specifically registering just to vote against Trump, and because we seek to reduce dissonance, will all those new voters essentially be stuck in needing to continually support Joe Biden just because they voted for him once, even if it wasn't so much a vote for Joe Biden, but against Donald Trump? Well, research from Bolstad, Dinas, and Riera 2012 may give us a good idea of what we might see going forward, utilizing data from the British election study for the elections of 2001 and 2005. Subjects were asked how much they liked or disliked Labour, the Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats, as well as the Scottish National Party in Scotland and Plaid Cymru in Wales. The researchers then identified tactical voters who specified that they did not vote for their preferred party or choice for a variety of reasons, including because they did not believe their favored party could win, or because it was more important to vote for a different party than their favored party for a tactical reason. They found that those who tended to vote tactically also tended to be very similar to the general voting public who vote sincerely rather than the portion of the public that generally does not vote at all. Tactical voters' strength of preference for their vote target were less robust than sincere voters, however. Looking further at the data, more than 75% of tactical voters vote for their second most preferred party, and interestingly, this very act seemingly improved assessments of that less preferred party, as tactical voting resulted in improved assessments of the party voted for by 0.85 on a 10-point scale. That is, if you voted for Trump because you despised Hillary, just voting for a Republican likely slightly increased your favorability towards the Republican Party just as a product of behavioral and belief consistency to avoid psychological dissonance. And the same likely goes vice versa for those who voted for Biden just because they despised Trump. A second analysis sought to understand how location influenced tactical voting. In some areas, it's kind of pointless to vote for a Republican because there are no Republican voters, and not a snowball's chance in hell that Republican could be elected. Again, I think to Kim Klacik running in Baltimore City, which is a D27 district. Although sincerely, as a fellow Baltimorean, love you, Kim, and I'd buy you an egg custard snowball with marshmallow topping any day. That's not an innuendo, it's just a Balmer thing.
Okay. Pronounce that word.
Balmer.
Balmer. B-A-L-M-E-R.
The point is, even those in the district who liked Kim Klacik and her ad campaign may not have bothered voting or may have just written in someone else simply because they knew she didn't have a chance. Does tactical voting even happen in regions where one party dominates? To understand that, in their second study, Bolstad et al. Chose to specifically look at areas wherein there was only a 5% difference between the leading and secondary parties. They found that whether or not a subject lived in one of these marginal districts where political races were very close, predicted the likelihood that that person would vote tactically. Moreover, in this study, looking specifically at areas where the political races are close, there was again increased positivity towards the party that one did not favor, but voted for tactically. But this effect was far more potent than in all districts overall. Specifically, tactical voting in these close districts resulted in an increase of assessment for the voted for party by 2.26 points on a 10-point scale. These results could be interpreted such that as the closeness between political races increases, the tendency to adopt high party preferences increases by nearly 10%. For example, in 2008, when it was fairly clear that Obama was going to sweep his first election, people were able to get a little bit more excited about third-party candidates like Ron Paul, whereas in 2020, it seemed that neither main party wanted anyone to, quote, waste their important vote on Joe Jorgensen. And there was maybe some real rationale for that, at least for the Trump supporters, because these 60,000+ votes for Jorgensen, had they instead gone to Trump, could have flipped the entire state. That's why libertarians in the US have such a tough time getting any portion of the vote in the first place, because tactical voting practices make the vote seem like a waste, particularly when elections are close. But the same is true of the back and forth predominantly between Labor and the Conservatives, with the Liberal Democrats typically being relegated into third place. However, it seems that once one votes Liberal Democrat or Libertarian, many don't go back, due to a need for behavioral consistency and dissonance mitigation, even if that vote is non-tactical. Instead, a tactical vote for a Democrat from someone who would rather vote for a socialist may otherwise feel dissonant. But via tactical voting, that action increases positivity towards the Democrat Party and thereby reduces psychological dissonance, creating potentially a lifelong Democrat voter in the process of just having voted once out of spite. This can cause a spiraling effect in that once you, as an independent or a centrist, have decided to engage in tactical voting just to keep someone out of office, you're likely to continue to vote for that party just out of a need for behavioral and psychological consistency to reduce dissonance. In other words, once you vote crack, there's no going back. But anyway, with that spicy meme behind us, let's come to a few conclusions. Politicians are just people in positions of power that we as the people have given to them. But because they are people, inevitably they will sometimes let us down, and that can cause dissonance when we have previously supported or voted for that politician. Up until 2016, I had always voted for third-party options, writing in Ron Paul in 2008 and Gary Johnson in 2012, so the first time I ever voted for a president who actually won, it was Donald Trump. When just a few months into his presidency, though, in April of 2017, he bombed Syria, I immediately felt dissonance, wondering if I should have just instead voted for Goofy Gary again. It was psychologically uncomfortable to think about voting for someone who, for a short period of time, seemed to be going right back into maintaining the forever wars with US as world police, a practice I despise. But later, that dissonance reduced as Trump helped bring some semblance of peace to the Middle East and maintained most, if not all, of his promises to stay out of foreign conflict. There is plenty of things that Trump did I disapproved of, but because ending US involvement in the Middle East was such a major promise of his campaign, when then 3 months in he violated that expectation I had of him, well yeah, that caused dissonance. Based on all the data that we've looked at today, I would guess there are also a lot of people out there who voted for Joe Biden as a tactical vote, as a negative vote, rather than because they actually liked the guy. And I think that it's possible that also can lead to dissonance when Biden makes a fool of himself on the national or international stage seemingly every other day. On the occasions where I felt dissonance towards my vote for Trump, that dissonance was because I really voted for him. I didn't vote against Hillary Clinton. But do those who voted for Biden just because they didn't like Trump experience that dissonance as well when Biden does something cringy or says something disturbing? Or is it possible that because the vote was tactical and not based on actual support for Biden, that Biden's gaffes don't then produce the same kinds of dissonance and psychological discomfort that it produces in those who voted for a candidate they actually supported? But hey, I didn't vote for Biden nor against Trump, and I've never engaged in negative or tactical voting before. Like I said, lifelong libertarian here, and tactical is probably the last word you could describe us.
I'm gonna marry a robot and sell my kidney on eBay.
But have you ever felt dissonance when a politician you voted for betrays their promises or behaves in a way that you dislike? If so, did you distance yourself from that politician? Try to explain their behaviors? Try to reduce how much information you learn about them from the news? Or try to find more positive information about them to assure yourself that you made the right choice in candidates? Have you ever engaged in tactical or negative voting by voting for a candidate you didn't really care for just because you couldn't tolerate the opponent? Have you felt discomfort if that politician that you didn't really vote for then behaved poorly afterwards? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider feeding that algorithm and helping out the channel by giving it a like and subscribing. If you really enjoy my content and want to help me out, consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, or by checking out my merch store, all of which are linked down below along with the citations as usual. You can also check out this video's sponsor, Established Titles, also linked down below. Thank you so much for watching, and an enormous special thank you to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. You guys really allow me to continue to be passionate about making this kind of content, which as you can tell is quite long and takes a while to put together. And sincerely, I am so grateful to all of you. Truly, thank you. And as always, Altana Volt.